Good afternoon and welcome. I will say a few words of thanks to Tom Ryan, who has cooperated with Greg Waldrop in bringing us these first Tuesday Cannonball conversations. So I thank him for organizing this for us, along with the rest of the committee organizing the 500th anniversary celebration of St. Ignatius. So I'll introduce Dr. Tom Ryan to introduce Ms. Tetlow.
Thank you, Father McGinn. So I want to welcome all of you here present, as well as those of you joining us online. So welcome to this event. Father Greg Waldrop, who's organizing the speaker series, was unable to join us today. He sends his regrets. My name is Tom Ryan, currently professor and director of the Loyola Institute for Ministry, and soon to be interim vice president for mission and identity at Loyola. This is the May edition of Cannonball Conversations that commemorates the 500th anniversary of St. Ignatius Loyola's conversion, forced on him by his encounter with a cannonball. It's also the 400th anniversary of the canonization of St. Ignatius Loyola and St. Francis Xavier, and so a good time to reflect on Ignatian spirituality and its implications for the church and world today. If you want to be put on a mailing list for future related events, or if you'd like to explore Ignatian spirituality at a deeper level through courses, degrees, or certificates offered by the Loyola Institute for Ministry, you can sign up on the sheets in the back. Today's speaker needs little introduction, but I'll offer a few words. In a kind of cosmic foreshadowing, Loyola University's 17th president, Tanya Tetlow, was born while her parents were at Fordham University in New York. She received her BA from Tulane, her JD from Harvard. She has worked as an assistant U.S. attorney. Before becoming Tulane's senior vice president and chief of staff, she was Tulane's Felder-Fayard professor of law and director of Tulane's domestic violence clinic. She is the first woman and the first layperson to lead Loyola. She's also the fourth woman president of a Jesuit college or university. Later this year, she will become Fordham's 33rd president, as well as the first layperson, first woman to lead Fordham. She brings amazing insight from her professional background and experience, but her personal background also makes her an appropriate speaker in this series. Her mother is an accomplished theologian. Her father was a Jesuit. Her uncle is a widely published Jesuit on Ignatian spirituality, and so on. Please join me in welcoming Loyola University New Orleans President Tanya Tetlow, who will speak on, how to hear. I lost you could say the title. I lost the title. It's a good title. It's a great title. Tanya Tetlow.
So I came up with the title before the talk, and it was aspirationally How to Hear God's Voice Without Need of Cannonballs. But when I wrote the talk, I realized it's very, very hard to do that. As you heard, I had an unusual childhood rooted in faith. With my father who'd been a Jesuit, my theologian mother, all the uncles who were Jesuits in the family. Dinner table conversations could become heated discussions about the politics of ancient Mesopotamia. If my parents didn't want to be understood at the dinner table, they spoke in Latin or ancient Greek. And it always confused me later in life, the notion that being religious meant that you were dumb or anti-intellectual, because in my family it meant preferably that you learned Aramaic and the other languages of the Bible, and you read all the hundreds of books that lined the walls of my home. We also grew up in a particularly joyful faith. Being raised in the 70s, my parents believed that children should be free to run around Mass during the liturgy. And I was reminded of that when I met an older Jesuit up at Fordham recently who said, kind of with embarrassment, "I knew you when you were 4." So at least I made an impression with my liturgical dance back in the day. But it was also a faith rooted in psychology, because my father, as a Jesuit, trained both in theology and philosophy and all the years of training that the Jesuits require. but also in the way that they are allowed, encouraged to get a doctorate in the field of their choice so that they can teach. He got his PhD in psychology and was a practicing clinical psychologist. And so I got from him the notion that God really wired us to take such joy in being good, that what is moral truth is also psychological truth, right? It was a real merging of those two things. So it's that way, you know, when you roll down your window and give money to a homeless person and you just drown in pride. You feel so good about yourself and what you've done. And in our own Catholic way, I used to have such guilt about that pride. But really, it's that God created us to take pleasure in doing good. And so my father's favorite hobby was to go to Costco and buy massive bags of cheap umbrellas so that when it started to pour in that way it does in New Orleans, where the skies just open up, he'd roll down his window and hand them out to people who were caught in the rain. He loved doing that more than anything. And I've come to understand that there's something actually very Jesuit about that, of how to honor that feeling in your gut about what it means to be good, of finding a way to navigate between humility, which is good, and shame, which is not productive. Between the kind of contrition that helps you grow and the useless self-flagellation that distracts you from growth. So after Ignatius took that cannonball in the leg, he spent years doing the far more traditional version of self-flagellation, quite literally, wandering as a pilgrim, denying himself food and comfort, dressing in rags. But he came around after many years to a different kind of existence. He realized that he could achieve more by building, by growing, by educating. And he created as part of that process a tradition that he hands down to us today of the daily examine, of asking yourself every night, where did I do well today? What literally felt good? And you know, centuries before Freud, the notion that you could trust your gut in that way was not exactly common. Where did I feel like I lived and became the person that I wanted to be today? And then to stop and ask, where did I not feel good? What felt wrong about how things went today? But instead of just stopping there, spiraling into shame, to then say, how do I do better tomorrow? Right? How do I do a little bit better? How do I live up to the values of who I want to be in a way that feels right in my gut? And so that's what we hope won't require a cannonball to get through to us. But of course, it's really tough to do that. And as much as I learned from my family about the Jesuit way of proceeding, it didn't really sink in that easily. I did grow up understanding that God had given me great gifts, because there are 3 of us and girls in my family, and our youngest sister is severely learning disabled. And for her, getting through school at all was an extraordinary accomplishment and struggle, far more impressive than me getting A's at Harvard. From her, my other sister and I really learned that being smart is a gift. It's a blessing, it makes life easier, but it doesn't make you better than anybody else. And a fundamental way of understanding that the gifts we've received come with responsibility, but they are not about status. They're not about being the source of your pride. But as a young adult, I struggled with that. My self-esteem was shaky, really built on sand. Did my value as a person lie in being smart? Well, that felt good, except the minute I got a B in something, I started to doubt who I was and my value to the world. Was my value as a person in being good? Well, I stumbled on that constantly. I thought endlessly, as young people tend to do, about what other people thought of me. Because it's only really when you grow up you realize that other people aren't thinking about you much at all, they're thinking about themselves, just as you're thinking about yourself. I volunteered in politics, frenetically networking, and thought I might find self-worth in whom I knew. I had that dash of arrogance rooted entirely in deep insecurity. And I didn't like that about myself, but every time I tried to cure it, I would spiral into shame. So what was my cannonball moment? One that's probably true for many of us here, Katrina. You remember, those of you who lived through it, the terror of it, the enormity of the aftermath, not knowing if you owned anything but the stupid bag you packed for that weekend, and suddenly not caring so much because you didn't know if you lost people. The endless despair of the year after year of recovery, the suicides. Nothing I thought mattered really did. Turns out not even electricity or internet or hot water really mattered. And there was this song I kept singing over and over in my head because the words just summed it up. And I'll turn. He talked about how little we have to count on, how much we're distracted and manipulated by modern technology, how much we fool ourselves with the mythology of the day, and we've lost trust in institutions and in our philosophy and our faith. But just when I was ready to throw the book away in despair, he ends it with this. The one thing you can hang on to, the one thing that in our matrix-like world you can believe in is this, that you look for the suffering of other people and you find a way to make it better. And that's what I did, so many of us did after Katrina. I finally shut off that self-involved voice of anxiety in my head, and I did something for other people in the ways that so many of us did, this community did in extraordinary fashion, the world came and did for us. I focused on the suffering of others and stopped worrying whether what I did, who I was enough, and just acted. I didn't worry about myself because to have self-pity when everyone around you is suffering just feels stupid. So why do we need those cannonball moments to break through? And why does it take suffering to make us learn? And most of all, why does God let us suffer? These are particularly big questions right now when it feels like all we do is dodge cannonballs, right? The hurricanes and the plagues, and we're waiting on the locusts. We don't lack for cannonballs, we're exhausted by them, but why do they need to happen? And this is the endless challenge of faith. We pray to God to intervene in our lives, to protect us from suffering. But of course, that implies that God lets us suffer, does it at God's whim. I remember after Katrina, people telling me how they escaped the flooding because they buried a particular saint in their garden and thus they were okay. And I used to think, so God didn't like me, right? It doesn't make sense. But I think I'm finally starting to have insights into it because of being a parent. I have a 9-year-old named Lucy, who I didn't expect to bring today, but she's here and will be very mad at me for mentioning her name. And I'm overwhelmed by how much I love her and how much she loves and depends on me. One day when she was 4, she took my face in her little hands and said to me, "Mommy, I love you as much as God loves you." It took my breath away. And you have no idea how much I would do to spare her any suffering in her life. All of you who are parents know exactly how much you would do. But of course, we can't. I remember very early on deciding to let her take risks on the playground, to climb trees, which is her favorite activity in life, and wondering, how am I going to feel if she falls and cracks her head open? How can I let her take these risks? But of course, she can't learn to be brave unless she takes those risks. And she can't learn to be kind unless she experiences unkindness herself and cries bitter tears about it. I can't give her free will. I can't train her in autonomy and how to make choices without letting her experience the results of those choices. And so I let her take risks, and I let her suffer the consequences for it, even though it kills me. And so it is with God. We have free will. We have the gift of that. And so we live with the terrible results of our choices collectively. We live embedded in nature, not immune from it and the forces that sometimes unleash on us. And there is no other way for us to learn. But in that, God loves us in the midst of allowing that suffering, letting us climb the tree, knowing that we will fall. And I heard a story recently that really brought home what that means. So you all know the writer Michael Lewis, our beloved hometown hero. I heard this through a mutual friend, but he's been talking about it on the radio, so I feel comfortable sharing it now. A year ago, his 19-year-old college student daughter was killed instantly in a car crash. Just an unimaginable hit. And Michael Lewis has a best friend, another famous writer, Dave Eggers. And Dave called him and said, "I'm coming over. I'm not going to bother you. I'm just going to sit outside so you know I'm there." And he sat outside Michael's house for 8 hours in his car, just so that Michael would know that he was there. And that's what God does for us, is to accompany us, to love us, to feel the pain and the suffering. God sent his son to feel that pain quite directly, to be mortal, to be vulnerable, to live and be joyful, but also to feel pain and to die with us. And that is our gift, to be loved as intensely and purely as my daughter loves me, to feel that love, to learn how to internalize it, how to love ourselves, and thus to be able to love other people, and how to grow day by day without need of cannonballs. Thank you.
So we have some time for questions. Tanya, you can partake.
Lucy, you have any questions? Yes.
What insights, what gifts, what ideas from Ignatian spirituality inform your leadership, and will you bring to forth with you?
So many. The question is, what parts of Ignatian spirituality do I bring to leadership? What I love about it is that not only is it the spiritual truth, but the Jesuits, or the company, as they're called, have been flourishing despite a whole lot of hits and opposition for 5 centuries, right? So for organizational theory and thinking about management, they actually have a lot of really good ideas. And I laugh because you can read the latest Harvard Business Review article, and it will all be things Ignatius was talking about in the 1500s. So the idea that you choose carefully who your people will be, who you hire, then you train them, in the Jesuits' case, for a decade or so. We don't usually have that much time, and then you give people autonomy. So it's a very hub and spoke organization where the only time Ignatius would scold people is when they kept asking him what to do in a mother may I kind of way. That he did not like. It's really such a joy to have a patron saint who was a higher ed administrator, right? He wasn't, a wonderful hermit in a cave. He was someone who engaged with bureaucracy and complexity and found so much wisdom in the thousands of letters and notes that he wrote that we have. I think that leadership requires incredible self-awareness. And you all can think of a lot of leaders who are not self-aware and how that plays out, right? It's not that we can snap our fingers and get rid of our weaknesses, and often they're the flip of our strengths. We can't have all the strengths because they are, at odds with each other often. You can't be the extrovert who's brave and makes your voice heard, and simultaneously the introvert who listens much harder and takes in the information. You are usually one or the other. But the self-awareness to not let your weaknesses be something that you trip over all the time. The ability to really see and take in information and listen really hard because you know your own biases, you know the filters through which you hear things. And then the process of Jesuit discernment is just a masterpiece in how to make decisions, really hard decisions. And there's so much complexity to it, but my quick way of summarizing it is that you listen really hard before you decide. These are for important decisions. You give them the time and the space that they need. You take in different kinds of information. You listen to different kinds of people, right? You really gather that first. You understand that it's not just about the decision that your head makes, right? I'm a lawyer and an analytical person. I can rationalize anything. It can't just be about that. You also have to think about the impact of the decision on people. Think about what your moral gut tells you about that decision. And Ignatius really had the insight that was countercultural at the time that, we are wired, if we are generally good people, to have a gut sense of what the right thing to do is, that we can trust that. And so to really sit with the decision, and boy, deciding to go to Fordham was one of those decisions that was incredibly painful and hard for me. And I would talk to my Uncle Joe, and he'd say, well, the Lord will tell you what the right answer is. And I tell him, well, the Lord is arguing both sides of the point. Sounds very much like my voice. But it was that, not to fall victim to rationalizations, really to pay attention to what the right thing is. And that's both on an individual level, but on a group level. I love the Jesuits will decide a hard question, and they'll argue one side of the argument only, and then pray on it, and then articulate the other side of the argument and pray on it. And it's such a brilliant way to really think something through, to not dig into your position before you've heard both sides. That's a very long answer, but I love the subject. Lisa.
In your time at Loyola, what do you think carried with you as the biggest joy, accomplishment, achievement that you've had over these years at Loyola? I'm not going to say your biggest achievement that the world would say so, but that gives you joy that's you're going to carry with you the rest of your life.
So, I didn't hear all of that, but what joy?
In your time at Loyola, what accomplishment or achievement brought you the most joy?
Oh, got it.
It's not necessarily the biggest that the
Right,
world would think,
right.
but that you're going to carry with you for the rest of your life.
What accomplishment at Loyola brought me the most joy? I think in a general kind of way of getting our swagger back, right? I mean, Loyola went through some really tough times, as you know, and it was just so hard. And for a community that is the warmest, most loving community that I've ever seen, right? Every time I'd hire a new member of the team, the new CFO would say, these are the nicest people on the planet. I mean, it is a place really fueled by love of the students, and that is palpable, and it deserves to have just a lack of anxiety and stress that had been true for years when it went through financial hardship. And so both to have that, we're still on that shaky time when we're out of the hole and we feel every slight acutely, but of feeling comfortable and safe again, but most of all, just having that sense of, yeah, we got this. We know who we are. We want everyone in New Orleans and the world to know who we are. And what I loved was capped off by something I had absolutely nothing to do with, our national basketball championship, which was really nice. But it just epitomized so much about Loyola because we are not at the NCAA level, and it is not, there's no capacity for athletics to be a corrupting force as it can sometimes, as you read in the newspapers, be in college athletics. And our students are students first. So what I'm just as proud of is that the cumulative GPA for our men's basketball team is 3.4. One of our star players is designing virtual reality technology to teach complicated math problems to little kids, just on the side, right? And that the team, when they swaggered in their victory, they did it for us, not for themselves. So that, you know, that hard part of kind of culture change and morale, that's what I'm proudest of. What will I take from New Orleans to Portland? Everything. They, when I was filming the video for my announcement, they wanted me to say, New York is the center of the universe. And I said, well, I can't say that. So I said, New York is the most exciting city in the world. I can't say it, oh, they wanted me to say it's the greatest city in the world. I was like, we'll see. I think my warmth and sense of embedded culture, I probably will have to learn not to nod and smile at every single person I pass on the street, because I think that'll get exhausting. I will say there was a moment, because I went off to law school at Harvard, all my friends went to New York law firms, and I was visiting them the next year, and they said, all right, we're gonna take you to a jazz club in New York so you can just stop talking about New Orleans so obsessively, because we do in fact have culture in the rest of the world. I said, okay. So we went to the Village Vanguard, and they hadn't really checked the schedule to know that Wes Anderson, who was performing, is from Baton Rouge, and Wynton Marsalis showed up, and they were both, hi, Tanya. I'm like, yeah. So, but I'm excited. I think my favorite line in all of the reaction was Father Justin Daffron, who will be succeeding me as interim, said to the newspaper that New York needs more New Orleanians. And I think that sums it up, that as much as if you could have bet so much money on me never leaving this place, but it does feel like we need to have an impact on the rest of the world too. And so that's what I hope to bring. Yes?
Do you have any recommendations for reading on Ignatian teaching on leadership and discernment?
Recommendations for reading on Ignatian spirituality and discernment and leadership. Yes, there's a great book by Chris Lowry, who was an ex-Jesuit, called Heroic Leadership, and he makes all the connections I was just talking about. I really love it. He went on from the Jesuits to be a banker, but he's thought a lot. He talks in the language of leadership theory, and in that practical sort of self-interested way of exactly why the spiritual aspects of the Jesuit way of proceeding are good leadership. And it's so funny to read all the explanations of that in business literature about, well, funny enough, turns out being a good and empathetic person actually works, right? And, but I think he makes those connections quite explicit. It's a really good book. All right. Thank you all so much.
Thank